All right. Welcome, folks, for this talk with Krish Ashok. Um, I'm super excited to welcome him. Um, I wanted to first start off by telling about the book Masala Lab, The Science of Indian Cooking, that he wrote. But he's here today to tell us the nearly 3 billion year history, the story of one of India's and the world's most popular dish, the chicken curry. Masala Lab itself explores the science of Indian cooking with the aim of making the reader a better cook and turning the kitchen into a joyful, creative playground for culinary experimentation. It uses simple first principles, middle school level science explanations, and hand drawn illustrations to break down what happens in the Indian kitchen. It also recommends algorithms and metamodels for common dish types and regional Indian sub cuisines. Krish Ashok is the global head of the digital workplace for TCS, Tata Consultancy Services, helping Fortune 1000 companies reimagine the future of work, a role that is at the intersection of technology, design, and culture. He's a trained Indian classical violinist who also plays the cello, electric guitar, and composes and produces music, available on all major streaming platforms. A particularly popular playlist is Sanskrit Rock, where he translates and adapts popular heavy metal and classic rock songs into Sanskrit. Ashok is also a regular columnist on food, science, and culture for publications such as Mint, The Hindu, Scroll, and BuzzFeed. So, with that, I would like to welcome Krish Ashok.
Hey, thanks, Anand. Thanks for that introduction. And this is a so the reason I sort of thought I'll frame this talk less like the usual talks that I give, which is usually very BuzzFeed style. Oh, 10 misconceptions about Indian cooking and 10 misconceptions about food science and so on, and make it into something a little bit more of a story-driven sort of exercise. And the reason for this is that I wrote Masala Lab at a time, obviously just before the pandemic. Uh, when I've been resisting writing a book for almost a decade. Yeah, the Penguin has been asking me to write something, and my first proposal to them was actually science fiction, humorous science fiction set in Chennai. And then they said, maybe you should consider nonfiction because people do not buy fiction during pandemic and when they're stuck at home and so on. And I sent them this proposal and they really loved it. So the tale of a curry is in a sense my way of explaining why I wrote Masala Lab. Right, cooking in India is an exercise, at least at home, largely done by women with little choice in the matter. And again, in a tradition that is largely orally transmitted, very little documentation. This is true of many things in India. Many great things have not been documented, have not been written down. The Rig Veda was written down thousands of years, after it was originally, composed and so on. Uh, and not only that, and women have not had access to literacy in this part of the world till about a couple of generations ago, right? So there's a tremendous amount of tacit wisdom in what is essentially a craft, but unfortunately treated as an art, right? Uh, Day-to-day cooking at home is really an engineering discipline. It's a craft. It's the art part of it is only when you're thinking about inventing a new dish. But cooking is essentially just taking a recipe from some place that you learned, then adapting it to the next generation, adapting it to the ingredients that you can find, and also changing it as people migrate. Indians who migrated to the North America adapt and use the kinds of chilies, the jalapenos, and other things that are available locally, and dispense with certain other ingredients like, say, curry leaves, which are not maybe easily available, and so on. So this is true of all cuisines in the world. And yet we kind of persist with this idea that there is authenticity in cuisine. I know this is, a real biryani does not have this ingredient and so on, which is all silly. Uh, the second aspect of this is also the fact that uh, we very rarely identify with the science of cooking. Right, and yes, Harold Megi is obviously a legend, and more recently, Kenji Alt Lopez and so on have really popularized the idea of science and cooking. But particularly when it comes to Indian cooking, there's a very curious resistance to thinking of it in terms of science. And it's not surprising because you actually have a tremendous amount of nutritional pseudoscience that kind of goes along with cooking, right? And so my focus was that no, why not just take cooking and make it accessible to everyone from a school kid, right? In the sense that the kitchen is the best place to bring biology, evolutionary history, chemistry, and physics to life, at least at the high school level, by just observing what happens when you actually cook, right? And so what I thought I'll do is that why don't I talk to you about one of the quintessential recipes from this part of the world. Why is it from this part of the world? Well, you'll find out, right? Chicken curry originated in this part of the world. I actually, any kind of chicken curry, right? Any kind of gravy dish with poultry originated in this part of the world, and we'll kind of find out how. And rather than describe a recipe or describe the science of how it happens, I'm going to tell you a 3 billion year story of how the chicken curry came to be. And in that process, hopefully impart some useful tips on how to make the absolute greatest chicken curry that you ever can. And there is evolutionary history, there is science, there is thermodynamics, there's chemistry, there's biochemistry, there's a little bit of neuroscience as well, but at the same time, a little bit of culture and history of colonialism as well. The term curry itself originally came from a Tamil word that refers to meat gravies. That's what curry essentially meant. But the English word curry, as was adopted by the colonial powers, is a very sort of like almost a parody, almost like a generalization of the diversity of Indian dishes that exist. A chicken curry with a sort of ubiquitous yellow colored, turmeric and chili powder infused set of spices, and the curry powder that you find in most parts, in most Western parts of the world, particularly in the UK, and so on. Right. So there is that. But I want to focus on the evolutionary history and the science rather than the cultural and anthropological history, which I think is important, but I think it kind of distracts from our issue. So welcome to the 2.7 billion year story of a chicken curry, right? So, well, to start off with the chicken curry, I think you'll obviously need. Let's get down to the plant ingredients first, right? And so we have spices, we have things like tomatoes, we have things like onions and garlic that kind of go into your curry. Uh, but when you really think about why are plants the way they are, why do they taste the way they are, you have to understand that about 2.7 billion years ago, you had these single-celled organisms that were largely dominating the planet, if you will. Uh, they made very interesting choices. So one of them ended up sort of symbiotically absorbing a bacterium, which became the mitochondria, right? And so these cells began to be called the eukaryotes, right? So, and eukaryotic cells turned out to be phenomenally powerful and phenomenally adaptable, and in a sense, the stepping stone to creating multicellular organisms, right? But what's interesting is that one particular eukaryotic cell had another moment of absorbing another kind of bacteria, in this case, a cyanobacteria, which had the ability to actually photosynthesize, meaning it had a pigment called chlorophyll that allowed it to convert sunlight between 400 and 700 nanometers into energy, absorb that energy, and then turn that into glucose, right? Using the carbon dioxide in the air, the water from the soil, and so on. And in this case, the single cell organism was obviously in the sea, so there was no soil there in that sense. But that was the birth of the first plant cell, if you will. And these were largely sort of free floating algae and plankton, which over time, terrestrial plants are very, very, very new. In a sense, all the things that we eat are relatively new in the evolutionary history, but it all goes back to the choices made by the cell that managed to absorb a cyanobacteria and start to photosynthesize. Now, why is that story important? Because if you look at how plants are and how fruits are and how vegetables are in the context of cooking, their texture, their flavors, their tastes all go back to these choices that was actually made, right? Why is chlorophyll green? Actually, plants are green because that's the one wavelength of light that they have no use for. So it's rather ironic. We associate the color green with plants, but it's the one color that they absolutely hate or have no use for, right? Because they reflect it. They absorb the other frequencies and so on and actually turn it into glucose. Now, what also ended up happening is that the first generation of phytoplankton was so successful in the early oceans that they changed the Earth's atmosphere drastically. The amount of oxygen that existed 2.7 billion years ago was much, much smaller. And then a very short time, we got to the 21% oxygen that we, 20 to 21% oxygen that we have. And here's the problem, right? The rapidity with which oxygen was produced did not give plants or these single cell plants enough time to adapt to a high oxygen environment, right? Oxygen, we kind of take it for granted. Oxygen is generally terrible. It oxidizes stuff. Okay. And so what happened is that photosynthesis ended up becoming inefficient, right? Photosynthesis is remarkably slow, right? So it takes a potato plant months to make a potato, and it takes an animal a few minutes to get all of the calories that are stored inside the potato, right? So in a sense, animals obviously have this advantage of being able to move, and plants do not move, largely because photosynthesis is highly inefficient, right? So these are because of the choices that were made billions of years ago. And so what plants do is that they use photosynthesis to turn carbon dioxide and water into glucose. And then glucose is literally the building block of everything the plant is, right? Everything from starch for storing calories for winter and poor conditions and so on, under the ground, which is what a potato is, and so on, or an onion for that matter. The other thing that they do is that they also form things like cellulose and hemicellulose, which form the rigid structures that you find that make up, say, trees and so on, right? Now, what is interesting is that because plants cannot move, they synthesize poisons, so they can only defend themselves biochemically, right? And so literally every vegetable and every spice, the quintessential flavor of that comes from the plants uh, trying to defend themselves, right? So onion, for instance, produces a volatile chemical called synpropanethiol oxide, which when you slice through the cells, about 30 seconds after you slice into a cell, an enzymatic reaction actually creates this volatile chemical, which when it rises above and hits your eyes, and it breaks down into dilute sulfuric acid, right? So that's why your eyes burn. So an onion is literally doing an acid attack on you when you cut it. And again, it goes back to understanding the fact that an animal dies. All cells of an animal die when the animal dies, because there's blood circulation, there's oxygen, so there's cellular death happens when an animal dies. So the piece of chicken or the piece of meat that you have in your fridge is dead, right? But every plant that you have, every vegetable that you have is still living, because plant cells do not die that way. They have a lot more localized control and so on. So plants die when you cut them in the kitchen, and they will try to defend. And how you cut them and how you choose to cook them uh, essentially incites the kind of sort of enzymatic reactions and other defenses, which either can spoil flavor or improve flavor, right? So the reason when we cut a potato, polyphenol oxidase is an enzyme that immediately starts turning it brown. This happens to an apple. This happens to most things, your brinjal or eggplant and so on. So you have to soak it in water. So this is why you have to soak it in water, because that's exactly what's happening, right? When you overcook spinach, what happens is that the chlorophyll molecule loses the magnesium ion inside it, and so it turns a duller green, right? So again, to keep it, so that's why you use a pinch of baking soda. It actually prevents a chlorophyll from losing the bright green color. But chlorophyll also breaks down pectin, so your palak paneer will turn into mush if you use too much baking soda and so on, right? So plants, at the end of the day, if every plant essentially produces different kinds of defensive chemicals. The ones that are relevant to us here, we spoke about onion. Garlic produces a series of very, very strong smells that are aimed at deterring sulfurous smells, that are aimed at deterring any sort of passing herbivore. But we sort of tame it down by cooking, when we actually like the flavor of sulfurous molecules. Things like curry leaves and garlic and so on all have sulfurous flavor molecules, like onion as well. And then you have spices like cloves and pepper and so on, each of which have very strongly insecticidal, very intense poisons, right? So the primary flavor of something like a clove called eugenol is actually toxic in high enough concentration, but the amount that's there in a clove is safe for you to consume in small quantities, right? So it's important to remember that at the end of the day, plants taste the way they are. They have rigid structures, which is why vegetables tend to be crisp and crunchy, whereas animal tissue tends to be soft. And we'll kind of get to animal tissue next, right? And last but not the least, it's because plants fundamentally produce glucose, and glucose is the building block of carbohydrates. What you largely get from plants is carbohydrates, right? when a plant makes proteins, it's usually not much, and it's not all of the essential amino acids that you eat, which is why vegetarians tend to need to sort of combine a vegetarian diet with some form of animal protein, be it milk, or have any other sort of way in which, or soy, or some specific kinds of plant protein that are actually complete proteins, and so on, right? So at the end of the day, uh, every one of our chicken curry ingredients, from onion, garlic, chilies, again, quite fascinating, right? Chilies produce a family of molecules called capsaicinoids. And capsaicin is remarkable because it fits into the temperature sensors in your body. And it's not just the mouth, right? The reason why rubbing chilies on your hand will cause it to burn, or when people use a pepper spray, it's again all capsaicin, right? Or when you use muscle pain relievers, right? The burning sensation of any kind of muscle pain reliever comes from capsaicin, right? It actually blocks all of those nerve sensors and sends a heat sensation, thus confusing your brain into thinking that that's the problem. So it actually sort of tricks your brain into ignoring the source of the actual pain. So these are called counter irritants, if you will. So capsaicin is a remarkable molecule because it fools your brain into thinking that your mouth is on fire when it actually is not. And then therefore your brain actually sends a lot more blood circulation. It makes you sweat to cool you down, and it also gives you a rush of dopamine, so that in case you're in pain, to counter that, and so on, which is why people are addicted to spicy food, and so on, right? So tomatoes and spices, things like cumin and curry leaves and coriander, all of these kind of are different. All of these have different flavor molecules which that plant evolved to fight against fungi, bacteria, and insects. Okay, so this is essentially the starting point of our chicken curry. Okay, so then we kind of get to the animal protein part of it, right? The jungle fowl uh, evolved in this part of the world. South Asia is where the jungle fowl was domesticated into the modern day hen and chicken that we today eat, either in the form of eggs or directly in the form of meat. And as we all know, birds in general are the last surviving dinosaurs, if you will, right? So around 65 million years ago, it is estimated that there was a asteroid collision in what is today the Chicks Club crater in Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula, and it is said to be the event that essentially wiped out most life on the planet, almost 80% of all life. All the large dinosaurs, literally, apparently, any animal over 2 kilograms apparently died, or did not survive a year, and so on. It's the smaller mammals, underground ones, and also the flying dinosaurs, the smaller flying dinosaurs, birds essentially, that managed to survive. And as we all know, dinosaurs, apparently, scientists believe that dinosaurs had feathers too, so they look kind of funny with feathers. But the interesting thing is that your birds are essentially flying dinosaurs. And then they were domesticated in different parts of the world. The jungle fowl was domesticated in India, in what is today India, in the subcontinent, maybe about 10,000 years or so ago. And essentially, domestication is actually quite a fascinating this thing. The wild jungle fowl lays about one egg a month. And that's not really too different from most females of both mammals and reptilian species, in a sense. But we have artificially selected ones that lay eggs at a higher frequency, to the point where you now have breeds of hens that lay about 300 eggs a year, right? So domestication has largely been about artificially selecting for certain traits, essentially, like laying more eggs, having a larger breast, more meat, weaker legs, poorer eyesight, so that the animal does not run away, right? And this is true for dogs. This is true for dogs are essentially wolves with poorer eyesight and less IQ. Otherwise, they'd be smart and they would just simply eat us, right? So, in a sense, domestication is really about humans being able to get animal protein without having to hunt for it, right? And then, so animal tissue, and again, in stark contrast to plant tissue, is foundationally built in a very different way. Animal cells are very different from plant cells. Animal cells are a lot more flexible, particularly muscle tissue, which we tend to eat, is made of cells that are exceedingly elastic. And that's why meat has the texture it does, and plants have the texture they do, right? Plants are crunchier, harder, and soften only when the starch inside them, carbohydrates inside them, are cooked. Whereas your protein, on the other hand, is largely just simply soft right up front and hardens as you cook it. So plant material softens as you cook it, meat hardens as you cook it. So sort of they work in very opposite ways. And salt dehydrates plant tissue, salt hydrates animal tissue, and we'll kind of talk about that in a way. So essentially, protein in for our chicken curry is going to come from this hen here. And what is also important is that animals also have fat. They have fat under their skin, which historically, till we discovered vegetable sources of fat like sesame, like groundnut, sunflower, and so on, cooking fat was largely from the skin of animals, right? Schmaltz, as it's in the case of chicken, lard in the case of beef or pork and deer and any other animal or mammoths for that matter that humans used to hunt and so on. So animal fat is largely saturated fat. And you have vegetable fat tends to be largely unsaturated, with some very interesting exceptions. Coconut oil is famously pretty saturated plant fat, so which is sort of makes it a very unique in that sense, right? So we'll talk about that. Okay, so you get the chicken from here, right? So fundamentally, why does meat taste the way it does? It's because animals have evolved largely to be quick or to be dead, right? Which is why if you eat game meat of any wild animal, it's going to taste fundamentally different. It will be much leaner, much less fat. And because the diet of that animal is going to be very, very diverse, the meat will smell a lot stronger, which is why game meat tastes the way it does, which is what we call in India the jungle. Sort of like, say, the country chicken has a fundamentally different taste because that hen is walking around and eating all kinds of things as opposed to just the corn or rice that a farmed animal might be fed, right? The second thing is, again, is that a wild animal is likely to have less fat because if it had too much fat, it would be dead. But whereas your farmed caged birds, if you will have a lot more fat, right? And again, the interesting thing is that because we grew up at a time when calories were not abundant, we love the taste of sugar and fat. And so, thereby we find ourselves with the problem with the dietary and nutritional problems that we do right now. So having kind of got that evolutionary history of where you got your chicken and where you got all your spices and tomato and ginger and onion and garlic and so on, let's really get into the kitchen. So what happens here is that the very first thing that you have to do is to figure out, what materials are you going to use, right? Are you going to use cast iron? Are you going to use aluminium? Are you going to use copper? And so on. So broadly, the considerations are pretty simple, right? In general, in modern times, stainless steel is literally the most convenient universal material because one, it's long lasting, and two, it's easy to clean, stainless and so on, and three, it is also notoriously sticky. Okay, so if you try to cook eggs on stainless steel, it will actually stick. And the reason for that is that proteins in general stick to metals, because the amino acids in the proteins tend to form bonds with the metal ions. And so therefore, no matter what metal it is, proteins in general, that's why eggs are notoriously sticky. And the one reason you should have a non-stick or a seasoned cast iron is so that you can actually cook eggs, right? Now, what happens here is that a lot of Indian food predominantly tends to be strongly acidic, much more acidic and much more sourer compared to a lot of Western food, right? All parts of India use very strong souring agents. Tamarind in the south, kokum in the west, vinegar sometimes in Goa and Bengal as well, and amchur in the north. Right, and there are and in addition to this, there are other unique local souring agents like gongura, which is sort of roselle leaves and so on. There are many souring agents. Malabar tamarind, specifically used for fish curries in Kerala and so on. Right, so strongly acidic ingredients, including even tomatoes. Indian tomatoes tend to be sometimes sourer than tomatoes that you might find in the West. And so if you use any metal that can react with these acids, the acid will leach the metal into the food, which is okay for iron because it's not harmful for you. But it will spoil the taste and the coloring of your dish. But with aluminum and copper, not necessarily good, right? So in general, think about what you're cooking, and in general, for Indian cooking, in my experience, stainless steel is the preferred. I know seasoned cast iron is becoming very popular in the West, but it's largely used for cooking things that are not very acidic. Indian food, on average, tends to be really, really acidic. I would just go with a high quality stainless steel if you really want to just buy one sort of pan, and then essentially get a good quality non-stick for eggs, right? So there's no other way to cook eggs, right? Now the other element is that a lot of Indian cooking, if you really think about it, largely uses a liquid medium cooking in the sense, or dry roasting, right? So in the sense that oven cooking is not as common in the Indian kitchen as as it is in the West. There are parts of India where there are oven baking traditions, but again, largely either introduced by Westerners, by the Portuguese in, say, Goa, the baking traditions there, and so on, and also among some of the bread baking and tandoor baking traditions of the Northwest, in the subcontinent, and so on, right? So largely, a lot of cooking here is fundamentally either you dry, when you cook something dry, you're using conduction, so the metal is directly transferring heat to the food. But when you're cooking in any kind of gravy, the moment you add water or when you add any kind of fat, you're cooking by convection, meaning that it's the liquid that is actually transferring the heat, if you will. In an oven, it's actually air molecules that's actually transferring this, right? So the key thing to remember here is that the temperature when you cook something directly on a metal is almost always above 100 Celsius, okay, above the boiling point of water, because metals heat up really, really fast. The moment you cook any gravy, any kind of gravy, the temperature is going to be much less than 100, because water has that property that as long as it's not evaporated, the temperature is going to be under 100 Celsius, right? And so therefore, what happens is that certain chemical reactions do not happen below the boiling point of water, right? The browning reactions, caramelization, many of these reactions require a temperature much higher, right? So, and for the purpose of time, how we tend to cook at home is just simply just put everything in one shot and kind of cook it in a gravy. So if you want to get the restaurant taste, if you will, you need to cook things separately. So for example, if you're making a chicken curry, if you are actually making, for that matter, say a potato curry or aloo gobi or something like that, you saute and fry the vegetables dry till they're brown, or you bake them and then you add them to the gravy. Never cook them in the gravy, right? So that's the difference between a restaurant style Indian food and home cooking, if you will, right? uh, the other thing is that, if you had to ask me what's the one thing that defines one sort of practice that defines Indian cooking, so if Japanese cuisine is umami centric, meaning that a bulk of the flavor comes from large amount of glutamates present in broths, such as your dashi broth, and the use of seafood and oyster, and mushrooms and so on. uh, Indian cooking is largely fat centric, meaning that all cooking starts with fat and ends with fat. It starts with trying to get spices to give up their flavor molecules to hot fat, right? You either do that at the start, you do that at the end, right? And that is how flavor is absorbed. Spice flavors are not water soluble. Most spice flavors are not water soluble, right? So, which is why you're able to put a ton of ginger when you're boiling tea. And it doesn't taste very strongly gingery, because most of the ginger is actually, the flavor is actually just lost. It's just lost to the air, right? But on the other hand, if you actually cook the ginger at a very low temperature in milk, you'll get a very, very strong ginger tea. But you have to be careful, because some of the unless the ginger is very fresh, it's actually going to be pretty acidic, and the acids will curdle the milk. So you might want to sort of use very fresh ginger if you're actually planning to make your masala chai directly in the milk and so on, right? The other thing about cooking also is that fundamentally cooking is the outsourcing of digestion, right? It's essentially the sorts of the brains that we evolved, the giant brains that human beings evolved. One of the biggest contributing reasons is the fact that we cook our food. So unlike other animals, which have to do a tremendous amount of effort to digest the food that they need to get the nutrients they want, cooking is essentially the outsourcing, the externalization of digestion, right? And we do this in many ways. It's it's not just heating, the use of acids, but it's also the use of things like friendly microbes through fermentation, right? So fermentation also is another process where we enlist the services of bacteria and fungi to break down the food into smaller, easier molecules. And smaller molecules are more easily detected by your nose as well as your tongue, right? It's a very simple thing, right? So taste buds have a very specific configuration, and a molecule needs to fit into it. Smaller molecules have a better chance of fitting into those sensors than larger molecules, which is why glucose tastes sweet, but starch, which is made of just glucose, but long chains of glucose in a polymer, sort of as a polymer, is does not it's bland, right? So potato does not taste sweet unless you keep chewing on it, and so your salivary amylase breaks it down into sugars, and at that point it actually tastes sweet. If you chew on a French fry or bread for long enough, it will ultimately taste sweet and so on, right? Now, Obviously, I think the most crucial reaction to understand in the Indian kitchen is the browning reaction, right? This is what happens when you heat anything above a certain temperature. Anything that contains both protein and carbohydrates, right, will undergo a browning reaction where amino acids react with glucose and form a wide range of exceedingly aromatic compounds that have caramelly, nutty, meaty, savory, kind of sweeter flavors as well, right? So this is what happens when you deep fry something. When you just take what your dosa batter and you put it on a hot tawa and it becomes golden brown, that's the Maillard reaction, because your rice and urad dal is just proteins and carbohydrates reacting in the presence of that hot temperature, which is well above 100 Celsius, to form those golden brown, much tastier sort of flavors that you're familiar with. This is what happens when you deep fry something, right? And again, an interesting thing to remember here is that fat is one of those things that does not actually react with the food. Okay, fat is merely a cooking medium. So it's really no different from cooking something in water. If you want to cook something at above the boiling point of water, you use fat, because fat has a higher smoke point. That's really all there is. So fat does not chemically undergo any changes during the cooking process. They are extraordinarily stable, right? And in fact, because fat doesn't mix with water at all, your digestive system uses an emulsifying agent. So literally all fats get turned into something like mayonnaise, where they have to go down to your intestine, and that's when they're broken down in your intestine into constituent fatty acids, right? So that's essentially what fats are, right? And what happens is that we kind of saw the evolution of vegetables and the evolution of plants and the evolution of animals. So what happens here is that plants, as I said, have crunchier, harder textures because their cell walls are made of pectin, they're made of cellulose and hemicellulose, most of which we don't actually digest. We're just feeding the gut bacteria, right? So when you eat beans or rajma, for instance, right, there are two kinds of starches called staphinose and raffinose and stachyose, which you cannot digest, incidentally, right? But they are eaten by the bacteria. And so they every time you eat rajma, it's like a buffet for them, right? So they get a lot of the starch, and they happily eat it, and they sort of release carbon dioxide. That's the flatulence and the discomfort that you kind of get when you eat beans in general, and that's not a bad thing, right? You might feel uncomfortable, but you're actually encouraging a more healthy quality of gut microbiome. So by all means, the Indian tradition that it's good to eat a heavy meal and burp loudly is not a bad thing after all, right? So and the last one, obviously, a very common misconception that somehow microwaves are bad. uh, Microwaves in the electromagnetic spectrum have lesser energy than visible light. Okay, all we're doing inside a microwave is switching the direction of the microwave of a very specific frequency, just so that it is able to flip water molecules inside food. Most food is made of water. We are also mostly water. Most of our food is also made of water, right? So as long as anything has a reasonable amount of water, it can be cooked in a microwave by simply heating the water directly inside it, right? So it's actually a perfectly safe way to cook anything. In fact, the reason it's so hard to directly cook potatoes is that they don't have as much moisture to actually cook it, right? So if you want to cook potatoes, you need to add a little bit of water in a small vessel and seal it with some holes so that you don't have an explosion. And that's you can actually boil potatoes in the microwave, reasonably simply, and so on. But you can also take advantage of many of these other these things that I spoke about, which is that if you understand that spice flavors dissolve in fat, right? You can actually take any kind of fat water emulsion, like a yogurt or like a coconut milk, right? If you're vegan and so on, right? You can dissolve spice powders as opposed to whole spices, right? So, and again, not like fresh spices like ginger, garlic, but actually like garlic powder or onion powder, which again are dehydrated versions of the spice itself and other spices into something like a coconut milk, right? And then take canned chickpeas. You can actually get yourself a sort of like a chickpea curry in under 3 minutes in a microwave, right? Because the water fat emulsion in the coconut milk will dissolve the spices into it, and as it heats up, as the water heats up, it will emulsify the starches in your chickpeas. That will then in turn cause the entire thing to thicken, and so therefore you essentially have a curry in less than about 3 or 4 minutes. So this is sort of like a quick fire microwave Indian sabji, if you will, right? So my sort of last few sections that I kind of wanted to talk about is fundamentally around, now that you've eaten the food, right, what's happening, right? So once what actually happens when you put food inside your mouth is, first and foremost, this traditional idea that there's a bitter region, and there are parts of your tongue that have these different taste buds, like on the side, and umami in the center and sweet at the end. That's actually wrong. It's sort of like a misconception that seems to have lasted for a long time. There are sensors for all tastes all over your tongue. The density of them might vary in different parts, and there are some parts that may have slightly more sweet sensors, and some part, like the back of your tongue, definitely has more bitter taste buds and so on, which is why bitter is always a taste that you detect right at the end, which is why we use the expression bitter aftertaste, right? It's an aftertaste and so on, right? But in general, what happens is that flavor is the combination of taste, aroma, and mouthfeel. Okay, and 80% of the heavy lifting of flavor perception is done by your nose. It's not done by your tongue. You can only detect five things with your tongue, which is salt, sweet, sour, umami, and bitter, right? And You can detect close to 10,000 different molecules, aroma molecules, with your nose. Now, there's another fascinating aspect of how this works, right? When you see something with your eyes, or when you hear something, right, there's a part of your brain that's a staging ground for all the sensory information to be filtered before you decide what to process, right? The mechanics of how this works is sort of still under research, but largely the idea is that if we process everything that we see, we'd go mad. It's just too much information, right? So there's a filtering aspect to a lot of the other senses, so that we are able to just focus on things that matter, things like faces, things like familiar faces, familiar sounds, familiar songs, song patterns, pattern recognition, as opposed to sort of taking in everything and then trying to figure it all out, right? But but in a sense, what is fascinating is that flavor perception is somehow seems to be unique, because there is no filtering. It goes straight to the part of the brain that deals with memories and nostalgia, right? And flavor memories are multidimensional, meaning that you don't just remember taste, you remember taste, aroma, mouthfeel, what it looked like, the color of the object, the sound that it made, and also the person who's cooking it, and where was it, and what was the other circumstances when you actually ate that, right? So this is why, as one of my friend rather bluntly puts it, all opinions of food are personal opinions. There is no such thing as a general opinion on anybody's food at all, because everybody's experience of flavor is absolutely unique. It's a function of what you grew up eating, what your upbringing was, what you did not eat, what you ate, and your identity, in a sense, your religion and many other things sort of determine what you grew up eating and so on. And how you process it is entirely down to your brain development. And everybody's experience is rather unique, right? And so there is that one, right? So the tongue literally only does sensing of just the five things, right? So it senses sodium, which is the detection of saltiness, right? It's just the detection of sodium ions. Sweetness is the detection of glucose. And also, what's fascinating is that there are other molecules that also fit into that same receptor. Alcohol is one of them, which is why alcoholic drinks sometimes taste sweet, because alcohol tends to sort of block that receptor, and fool you into thinking it's sweet. Citric acid, strangely enough, despite being acidic in low concentrations, when it's in high concentrations, it tends to actually sort of attract the acid detectors, which is the sourness sensor, right? But in dilute concentrations, citric acid also fits into the sweetness receptors. This explains why, if you drink lemonade, or just bite a piece of lemon and then drink water, or if you bite into a gooseberry or an amla and then drink water, it will taste sweet, because at that point you're diluting the citric acid enough to the point where it triggers your sweet sensors far more than it's detecting your acid sensors, and so on, right? And again, what's interesting is that everybody's metabolism and digestion is also pretty unique. And not only that, that fermentation is in some sense also helping out digestion, right? So for example, urad dal by itself does not give you all of the vitamins and all of the amino acids that you need, does not make them bioavailable until you get some lactobacteria to break it down for you. Okay, so fermented urad dal is several orders of magnitude more nutritious than the regular urad dal, which is much harder to digest and so on. And it's not surprising, because the plant did not evolve for you to eat it. Okay, so the plant wants to do everything to prevent you from eating it. And legumes are particularly notorious. They have lots of what we call lots of chemicals that are kind of, that prevent you from absorbing nutrition so easily, so that you would not consider it to be an attractive meal, right? So saponins is a family of molecules that, the Latin origin of the word soap comes from saponins, right? So when you cook any kind of legumes, it's frothy because of the saponins. And in fact, saponins are actually, sort of anti-nutrients, in the sense that they prevent you from absorbing other nutrients. So when you're pressure cooking lentils, you add a drop of any kind of fat, that will neutralize the saponins, and actually, save your pressure cooker from all that frothy stuff that comes on top, but also help, improve the nutrition of the dal or the legume that you're actually cooking. So fermentation again is human beings sort of working out that there are friendly bacteria, and I'll create conditions like slight amount of salt, which sort of makes conditions not very friendly for the really bad bacteria, but makes it easy for the lactobacteria and so on, and also for the yeast to do their activity, and to eat what they want, to break things down into smaller molecules. And smaller molecules tend to be more easily bioavailable. They smell better because our sensors detect them better, and so on. So in general, fermentation generally produces a tastier and better, more nutritious food, right? So my sort of last segment, if you will, is that, having sort of looked at all of this science, my intent is literally to say that, look, the kitchen should be a place of joyful experimentation, right? So, right from when you actually heat a vessel, to when you add water, or when you watch milk boil, and when you watch it painfully, you understand, you learn sort of specific heat capacity of water and the latent heat of water in school. But it comes to life when you boil milk, right? Because it just takes such a long time. And you're wondering what's happening, then all of a sudden it will overflow. Why does milk overflow? Because the fats in the milk actually form a layer on top of the milk and prevent water vapor from escaping. So literally, what is happening is that you're waiting for the pressure of the water vapor inside, under that fat layer, to exceed the gravitational weight of the fat layer on top of the milk. That's when milk literally boils, and so on, right? So you can kind of bring all of these things to life, for your kids, and for generally understanding what actually is going on, uh, and also understand where your food comes from, right? I'll give you a very simple example. People will sort of go after these very simplistic notions of, you should eat local, right? No, not really. Eating local in every situation is not often a good idea, because I know for a fact that growing avocados in Bangalore, outside Bangalore, is not great. It's not suited to those conditions. It requires a certain kind of soil. It requires a tremendous amount of water resources, etc., which that part of the world may not have, right? So sometimes remember that the cost of transporting food is a very small component of the total energy cost of food, right? So there are some situations where you're actually better off importing something as opposed to trying to grow it locally, right? When you're thinking local, try and also pay attention to the fact that it has to be genuinely local, in that it has to have been growing there for a long time, right? So it's completely integrated into that ecosystem, right? So rather than sort of simplistic notion of, what is local, and I must only eat local, and that's what is sustainable, and so on, right? And I think ultimately recognize the fact that flavor perception, and the fact that the part of the brain that deals with flavor perception is the same part of the brain that deals with nostalgia, right? A lot of our language reflects that, right? So we use expressions like bitter aftertaste. The word disgusting literally refers to food, right? Gustation is food, and so on, is to eat, and so on. So what happens is that, don't judge other people's food, don't judge their other choices, and particularly common in India in terms of how we judge other people's food choices, be it vegetarian, regular food, or beef versus pork, or whatever it is, or eating insects for that matter. There's a fascinating story of how, when a chef from the Amazonas region in Brazil ate Thai food for the first time, his reaction was that, oh, it tastes like ants. And essentially it contained lemongrass. Now, what's interesting is that most black ants, the wood ants that you find on these big trees, the big black ants, right? They produce the same defensive chemicals that lemongrass and citrus plants produce. It's called limonene and linalool, right? These are found in ants as well. So, in fact, it is quite a common amongst communities who live in the forest to actually just crush ants if they don't have access to citrus, to get that sort of lemony, citrusy flavor in their food, even in India as well, right? So, it's just that your experience of food is purely limited to what you grew up eating, right? So, if you grew up eating dosa, all your life, your definition of comfort food and your definition of what a dosa is shaped by literally what you grew up eating. And the more you end up eating that, the less tolerant you are of any kind of variation to that. Sort of formula, right? So what happens is that when somebody makes a Szechuan dosa or a chocolate dosa, you immediately react and say, "How dare they do that?" Right? No, that person has not grown up eating dosa, so they do not have memories and nostalgia of dosa as a comfort food. So they are willing to be more novel about something that they've not eaten. It's very hard to embrace novelty around your comfort food. That's the reason why it's called comfort food, and so on, right? And also, geography does not lend authenticity to food. People do, and people migrate. Ingredients migrate. The most Indian and yet the least Indian dish is pav bhaji. Okay. The word pav is a Portuguese word for bread. Baking was introduced by the Portuguese. Potatoes were introduced by the Portuguese. They actually come from Peru. Chilies and tomato and bell peppers and capsicum were introduced by the Portuguese. They also come from Mexico. Uh, Carrots and cauliflower, beans, and these vegetables were introduced by the British. In fact, in many parts of South India, they're called English vegetables. So there is, barring the spices, which is the pepper and cumin and coriander and so on, there is not a single ingredient in pav bhaji that is of Indian origin. Okay, and yet I would actually argue that's what makes it uniquely Indian. It is syncretic. It is literally the fusion of many cultures. It's the fusion of the intersection of a colonial power with a colonized power. It's the intersection of a labor class workforce working in mills in Bombay, wanting to be fed food that is really quick, and often very dubious vegetable quality. So they would add tons of butter to actually just make it more palatable, and so on. And the introduction of these spices as well, right? So in a sense that, and this is true of almost every cuisine. No cuisine is authentic. All cuisines are fundamentally down to people who ultimately at some point of time migrated. Okay, unless you are an aboriginal tribe who's been living in the same place for tens of thousands of years, there is no business calling any food as authentic, right? So that's really number one. Okay, and the last but not the least, organic food, organic vegetables taste good for the reason that I mentioned on the slide one, which is the fact that plants defend themselves against invasions, against pests, by producing defensive chemicals, right? And these defensive chemicals, the more of it produces, the tastier the plant is going to be. That's the reason organic produce tends to be smaller in size but tastier, because the plant has obviously had more of a statistical chance of undergoing pest attacks. So that's why organic produce tastes better. By the way, I mean, the problem with labeling obviously is that modern day labeling of organic has more to do with compliance rather than a genuine sort of spirit of organic agriculture and so on. So a good tip that I have for people, at least in India, is that when you go to a vegetable shop, please don't buy the pretty looking vegetables. Buy the most scarred, sort of misshapen, ugly looking vegetables, because there's a good chance that that plant probably underwent a pest attack and it survived, and so its vegetables are going to be way more tastier. Always pick the tomatoes that have a little bit of scarring, slight black spots, a little bit of those depressions, and are smaller and misshapen in size. Those are going to be your tastiest vegetables, not the big slick looking ones which probably were protected by pesticides, and really just saw no kind of pest invasion all their lives, right? So at the end of the day, the more a plant gets invaded by pests, the more tastier it's likely to be. It's that sort of a balance. And last but not the least, frozen carrots are almost always fresher than fresh carrots, at least in India. Carrots grow in colder places, and if you're living in a city in India that is not close to the mountains, chances are those carrots are coming from 400 or 500 kilometers away, and they have to be harvested at a suboptimal nutrition and ripeness so that they survive the transportation and the supply chain. Uh, on the other hand, frozen carrots are harvested at peak nutrition and frozen very quickly after they're actually harvested. And freezing, as long as your power stays, without, you don't have a blackout and so on, -15 is as good as freezing time. Okay, so a frozen carrot is almost always fresher than a frozen carrot is almost always fresher than a fresh carrot, with the exception of you going to a backyard and digging up a carrot out of the ground. Maybe that's really fresh, yes, but other than that, frozen vegetables are really fresh. So I want to bring it all together by sort of playing you a chettinad chicken curry. So again, the reason we sort of dry roast spices is that heating spices actually sort of unlocks a lot of their flavor oils so that it's easier to extract them into the fats once you do that, right? So almost sometimes around 70 to 80% more flavor can be extracted from slightly dry roasted spices, right? So again, you're adding the onions, and again, these are the shallots, which are more common in South India. They have a sweeter taste profile, and curry leaves again have a sulfurous, a meaty taste profile, and so on. So one of the interesting things about particularly South Indian cooking is the idea of making what we call spice paste. And in this case, I'm actually using chicken fat itself, which is very, very tasty. And you should always ask if you're buying meat, always ask for the cuts with extra fat and then render that fat. And trust me, it is the best tasting fat you can imagine, right? So again, it uses this technique of sort of layering flavor. So I did sort of cook all of the onions and ginger and garlic first, but I'm going to make a paste of it with those dry spices. And then I'm using the same vegetables, but I'm not cooking them down entirely. So that I get a textural variation, right? So again, meat, because as I said, when you brine your meat, when you soak it in salt water, salt actually prevents muscles from losing water. And that's, by the way, when you when you get dehydrated, you should always eat sugar as well as salt, right? Because salt prevents you from losing that moisture. Then you add back that sort of spice mix, if you will. Then you get a chettinad sort of chicken gravy. And what happens is when you slow cook meat that has bones, and when I say slow cook, the temperature has to be in the 60 to 65 Celsius, not very hot at all. What happens is that the collagen in the connective tissue will turn into gelatin, and that actually gives a very unctuous and smooth sort of flavor, if you will. And almost always, in general, always add salt as well as sugar, because both of these amplify flavors. In a dessert, a tiny amount of salt amplifies other flavors, and in savory dishes, a tiny amount of sugar amplifies other flavors without tasting sweet. Why? Because we have evolved to detect even the smallest amount of glucose in our food. So you're signaling to the brain that this food might be high calorie, and it tricks your brain into amplifying all of the other flavor profiles because it wants you to eat more of it. So you can actually get away by adding a teaspoon of sugar. It won't taste sweet, perceptibly sweet to you, but your brain knows it's actually sweet, and it actually amps up everything. So restaurant food almost always has almost equal parts salt and sugar, right? So that's how this is made. And then finally, again, uh, I'm using the more traditional sort of South Indian way of garnishing, not coriander leaves, which came much later. Curry leaves was sort of what was always used as a garnish, at least in the deep South, and particularly the young leaves. So they're not very fibrous, and they're astonishingly sort of easy and soft, and so on. So if you do have a curry leaf plant, it is one of the most amazing flavors, and it actually makes a dish taste more South Indian than any other sort of single ingredient, if you will. So on that note, thank you. And so now maybe we can get into sort of Q&A and so on.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ashok. It's always exciting to hear you, and seems like on any topic you can almost have a talk on just that single topic of, say, acidity or salt or any of these. I have a few questions to ask you. Some of these will be very easy and quick.
Yep.
One of the questions I had for you is, there are many devices in kitchenware that have been in kitchens for a long time, right?
Yep.
And then there is a whole lot of innovation that has set in over the last, say, 20 years with the technological revolution, right? And
Yes.
I had a very simple question to you. For mostly Indian cooking, do you feel that there is one particular device out there which is not used that much, which I think will go a very long way in helping people? Do you have any? Obviously, you don't need to mention any brands, but just the
I think
type
that,
of
yeah.
device is enough.
So there are several. So in general, one of the problems with Indian cooking is that there's always been a historic resistance to devices, because one is that men didn't cook, then men designed these devices. They're mostly poorly designed, and so on. The other thing is that And so the sense of, oh, it has to be fresh, so somehow any device that makes life easier is somehow bad, and so on. But on the other, I would actually say that I think the category of device that I think is there are three devices that I think are fundamentally underutilized, and these are things that most people have. One maybe is something worth getting. One is the instant pot category of what you call electronic pressure cookers, of which there are now 100 variations now, right? Every brand has an electronic pressure cooker now, and these are really, really cheap, 5,000, 4,000 rupees, and it's totally worth it. One shot, slow cooking, pressure cooking, all different kinds of pressure cooking, making yogurt. It is well and truly a Swiss Army knife of Indian cooking, in a sense. I think that's definitely one. The other one is clearly, I think, the microwave is very much underutilized. There are so many situations where you could parallel process and make things in the microwave that you don't have to use your stove for, cooking potatoes. In fact, even making single portions of rice. All of these things are perfect. Of melting butter to the perfect consistency, bringing butter to room temperature is a very hard thing to do unless you're in Chennai, right? And then there is the other one is the freezer. It seems very bizarre, but most Indian homes, the freezer is mostly empty. Okay. um, and I often urge people to buy fridges with larger freezers and just don't store meat and ice cream in that. Just store all your spices, all your flours, all your legumes. Trust me, their shelf life will vastly improve, right? And if you're living in a tropical part of the world, no matter how airtight you stuff, the urad dal and the atta, all of that, they have larvae inside. They already had it. Okay, so they will hatch and start eating that at room temperature, no matter what you do. So please keep it in the freezer. And so I think these are the three things that I would absolutely insist that people use better, and also definitely invest in an electronic pressure cooker.
Got it. Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, the next question I had for you is slightly different from actually just cooking. Um, we know that in India, the amount of wet waste that is generated is very, very high, right?
Yes.
Do you have any tips on how to reduce it and maybe reuse some of the things we think to be wet waste?
Oh yeah.
Maybe they are reusable. Do you have some idea?
Yeah.
There?
So first and foremost, plants evolved so essentially fruits and vegetables, fruits essentially, right? Evolved to protect the embryo inside. Okay. And so they put the embryo is at the center, and then it's a lot of food for it to eat, and then there's a protective layer, the peel outside, to prevent any physical damage and so on. And the plant has actually invested most of its biochemical defenses are just under the peel, or either on the peel or under the peel. Okay. uh, and oddly enough, I find a lot of Indians wasting that. Okay. They think that, oh, potato has to be peeled, carrot has to be peeled, ginger has to be peeled. No, they don't have to. They have a ton of flavor. Okay. If you find them too fibrous, but be careful about how much peel you're removing. You don't have to remove much. That's number one. Okay. And if you do at all remove the peel for textural reasons and so on, please do not throw them away. Please store them in the freezer. Please store them in a bag, right? The parts of the onion, that the papery outside parts, the papery parts of the garlic, the parts, the root of the garlic, the roots of coriander, the stems of the coriander, all of these are complete flavor bombs. Okay. So please freeze them. One of the things I do is that on weekends, I just bring a big pot of water to boil and add all of these peels, wash them a bit, and then add them to that, right? So what happens is that all of their flavors get into that, and you actually make a fantastic stock. Okay. Uh, so then you can remove all of those pieces, and then you can do composting. You can sort of, you can, put it in a garden, just drop it in a pot. You don't have to compost, right? People overthink that. You can just drop it into a pot and grow other plants, and it'll grow really well. Everything from eggshells to everything, can be dropped into a pot, and things will be perfectly fine. And please extract all those flavors, make that vegetable stock, filter out, and store it in your fridge, and use that when you make your dishes, and you'll find that everything tastes just phenomenally rich, because so much flavor is in the peel of the potato, peel of the carrot, peel of the onion, garlic, and so on, and ginger as well. Yeah.
Okay. So we're almost running out of time. I'll just ask one final question. Um, you know, forever there is this tussle between, hey, what tastes great may not be good for you. And if it's probably doesn't taste good, maybe it is very good for you, right? Why have we not? I mean, we've been able to, create long canals. We've been able to divert rivers, roads.
Yes.
Why have we not been able to change this tract to separate out the experience and the nutrition?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's the problem, right? So all the advancement of human beings has happened in a very short period of time. evolutionarily meaninglessly short period of time, meaning that evolution hasn't had enough time to actually adjust for that. So we are in some sense imprisoned by the multi-billion year evolutionary path of pre-stone age apes, right, who were calorifically starved, largely hunter gatherers, omnivorous, and all of it's not just eat. Many other problems that we have, including human proclivity for back pains and all of that, come from the evolutionary choices that were made then, but have not had time to adjust to modernity, if you will, right? And the fact we know sugar is so cheap. See, sugar before slavery and colonialism was phenomenally expensive. Okay, Europeans used to have like one packet of sugar and use it their entire year and all that. Now sugar is just too cheap, right? And so the second reason is that the amount of research that has gone into eyesight, hearing, and every other sense is 100 times more than the amount of research that has gone into olfaction, because historically olfaction was not seen as a critical sense, right? Only now are we recognizing that it's actually very, very central. And olfaction is very central to flavor perception, right? And it is that flavor apparatus that makes it so addicting for you to eat sugar and eat unhealthy food and eat high carb food and high fat food and so on. But there are now some recent breakthroughs where understanding the neural pathways that make up how you get these flavor molecules and understanding the sensor and the three-dimensional apparatus that makes this possible, they're now saying that we should be able to synthesize chemicals that can trick these pathways, right? So in a sense, that can make something like kale taste like French fries. Okay. So if I can biochemically alter that in such a way that I can make kale taste like French fry, then people will like gorge on kale. That's a win-win for us. Okay. So but
No,
we're still
also,
far
Ashok,
away from being able to do that. Yeah.
yeah, no, Ashok, I hope we also get to a point where we have foods which we actually don't put into our bodies. And we just smell and this thing, we get the pleasure and we are fine. We are safe.
Well, I know, but you have to tweak a whole bunch of. It's a complete ecosystem
We'll,
down to your stomach, right? It's very, very hard to trick
yes.
the entire thing.
Anyway,
True.
cool. Thank you. Thanks so much, Ashok, for coming and enlightening us.
Thanks, Anand.
Thanks so much for joining. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye bye.